As always, Steve, thank you for that reminder. As they're going to have their time, we're staying in here and ask that you would look again at the scriptures that we read before. We're going through a series on Jesus is Lord through select scriptures, the Gospel of John. We're looking at the 19th chapter today, and particularly that he is more than a man. It is Easter Sunday. That day when we will respond to just about anyone who says, "He is risen," with a resounding, "He is risen indeed." Yeah, but before we continue that annual celebration of this day when we celebrate Jesus in his resurrection from the dead, we're going to kind of back up in the story just a little bit. To that moment whenever Jesus was standing before Pilate, being interrogated by him. Pilate, if you recall, was Rome's infamous governor of ancient Judea. He was questioning Jesus because the Jewish leaders who had already made up their minds about Jesus had brought him before Pilate, but they wouldn't enter into the praetorium, which is where Pilate's residence was and where his chambers for making judgments were, and his space, and his courtyards. They wouldn't enter in that place because, well, they didn't want to defile themselves by doing something that went against their understanding of the law. It would have made them ritually unclean, and that meant they wouldn't be able to observe the Passover, and that's why everyone had gathered in Jerusalem. It is the kind of legalistic hypocrisy that Jesus had been pointing out about them all during his ministry. Upon seeing Jesus in their midst, whenever Pilate went out to the gate to greet them, he said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they claimed, "Jesus is an evildoer." I know that accusation doesn't sound all that bad today. But the word that they used back then meant that Jesus had deliberately done what was prohibited by their understanding of the laws after being repeatedly warned to stop. And he deserved to be punished for what he continued to do. But they did not accuse Jesus of being a murderer or a thief, which, if you didn't know, are both accusations along with being called an evildoer that were often made of those who in the early church as it was emerging. In response to those kinds of accusations, Peter said in his first letter that it is one thing to be accused of doing such things, and quite another to be guilty of actually doing them. Peter went on to say that if those in the emerging church kept doing what was right according to Jesus' teachings and suffered for it because they were falsely accused of doing evil, it would be to their glory. But if they were guilty as charged, then their suffering would be justified. Peter concluded that if you're going to suffer in this life, then it's better to suffer for being falsely accused. It is better, he said, because that's what happened to Jesus. Now, not everyone who follows Jesus is going to suffer for it. I mean, some people are actually praised for doing the good things that come along in living life as Jesus called us to live it. But some, like Jesus, are falsely accused of doing evil things, and they will suffer at the hands of those who really are the evil ones. There is a part of us that recognizes that this is an injustice. And that part of us wants to stand up and fight for what is right. Like Peter did whenever he took the sword from one of those who came with Judas to arrest Jesus. Peter thought that he was defending Jesus when he took the sword. He thought he was doing what was right, that he was defending an injustice whenever he slashed off the ear of a man with that sword. But Jesus saw it otherwise. Jesus saw what Peter did as wrong. He took the sword away from Peter. He restored the man's ear. And he accepted the unjust suffering that would lead to his death. What Jesus did It goes against our very nature. We want to fight against injustice. Now, it didn't make it into any of the versions of that very popular Easter movie, Ben-Hur, but it was in the book that all the movies were based on. If you haven't read the book of Ben-Hur, I encourage you to do that sometime. In the book, Ben-Hur saw Jesus being led to the cross down the Via Dolorosa. He was, by that time in the book's storyline, already a believer. Some of the other believers that he knew began to encourage Ben to join them in an effort to intervene and free Jesus. But he declined, because Jesus had already told him, whenever he told Peter and the other disciples, which is in the scriptures, that his unjust suffering was a part of God's plan to bring freedom to everyone who is a slave to sin. And so he turned and he walked away to let Jesus suffer. Pilate was caught up in God's plan, although he didn't realize it. Pilate immediately recognized that the Jewish leaders' accusation against Jesus was really not about breaking a Roman law, but about Jewish ones. And so Pilate told these leaders to go judge Jesus according to your own laws. He may not have known that they had already judged Jesus during the night and more than once. And because they had already done what Pilate was asking them to do, they complained. They said, we're not allowed, we're not permitted to put anyone to death, because that's what they had decided to do with Jesus. While some crimes are worthy of being punished by death, even today, no one would ever want someone who was falsely accused to suffer such a fate. And since some people who are falsely accused can end up facing the death penalty, it is often argued that we should do away with the death penalty altogether, lest an innocent person be punished for the guilty person's crime in an irreversible way by mistake. But what Jesus was doing was no mistake. The Jewish leaders' authority to invoke the death penalty was taken away from them by Rome because they felt that these Jewish leaders used it to punish people for crimes that Rome did not, in their estimation, consider worthy of death. Rome only invoked the death penalty for citizens who committed treason or murder or robbery or arson. And they were not accusing Jesus of any of those. Non-citizens could also be put to death for adultery and rape and counterfeiting. But beyond that, other penalties were felt sufficient. Now, you've ever read the Old Testament, then you know that a lot of it calls for other sins that go way beyond that small list that Rome had to be punished by death. And the Jewish leaders often enacted the death penalty, even in Jesus' day, especially when it suited their purposes. Rome felt that they were doing the Jewish people a great favor by preventing their leaders from invoking the death penalty on them without just cause. And now, here were these same leaders insisting that Jesus be put to death for being an evildoer. The likelihood that this request was unjust compelled Pilate to take Jesus into his praetorium and examine Jesus for himself, trying to determine if Jesus had committed a crime worthy of death, like treason. Which is why Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus didn't answer his question, but instead asked Pilate what inspired his question. Was he interested in Jesus' true identity, or was it a question based on some other motive? Pilate was not interested in learning about Jesus' identity, only whether he broke a Roman law or not. So he told Jesus the truth. I'm not a Jew. Why would I care? In other words. And then Pilate reminded Jesus that it was his own nation and his own chief priests who had delivered Jesus into Pilate's hands. Trying to evaluate the accusation against Jesus, Pilate finally asked him, "What have you done?" And Jesus confessed what he had done. He had come to establish a kingdom. But it was not a kingdom of this world. If it had been of this world, Jesus' followers would have taken up arms and prevented him from being captured by Jews in the first place. He would have commended Peter. But as it is, his kingdom is not of this realm. From which Pilate surmised and asked, "So you are a king?" And Jesus affirmed, yes, he was a king. It was why he had been born. It is why he had come into the world. He had come specifically to bear witness to the truth about himself. A truth that would set all men free. Jesus told Pilate, "Those who are of the truth, they'll recognize my voice," implying that they would also be the ones who would comprise Jesus' kingdom. Pilate obviously was not among those who recognized Jesus' voice because he asked Jesus, probably from frustration, "What's truth?" Jesus could have said, "I am the truth, and the way, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me," as he had done before. But he remained silent. And Pilate went back out to the Jewish leaders and those now gathered along with them to give his judgment of the man. "I find no guilt in him." That is, Pilate didn't consider that what Jesus had confessed to doing was worthy of the death penalty. Hoping to bring an end to the Jewish leaders' desire to enact the death penalty to further their insistence on injustice, Pilate gave those gathered a choice of which prisoner he would release in keeping with a Passover custom. But his surprise, they did not want the king of the Jews, but a robber named Barabbas. He had broken Roman law. He did deserve the death penalty. Now, if you didn't know, Barabbas' first name was also Jesus, we find in the Gospels. So the crowd is really being asked, which Jesus do you want? The Jewish leaders would later slip that one of the evil things that Jesus did was to claim that he was the Son of God. So Pilate was asking him, do you want Jesus, the Son of God? Or do you want Jesus, the Son of the Father? Because that's what Barabbas, son of Abba, the Father, meant. Their choice of Barabbas actually advanced God's plan to save the world through the sacrifice of his one and only Son, who would take the sins of the world to the cross and rise victoriously over an unjust death on the third day. The text we read earlier in our worship service is what happened next. It recalled how Pilate had Jesus flogged, and after which the soldiers who carried out Pilate's order twisted together a thorn of crowns and jammed it onto his head. They also put on that purple robe of royalty, and they came up to him mockingly saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," as they slapped him in the face. It was after watching Jesus suffer that ridicule that Pilate went back out to the crowd who had gathered at his gates, who didn't see that, awaiting his final judgment. And Pilate told them again, "I find no guilt in him." And then he had Jesus brought out, the spectacle of Jesus with the crown of thorns and the purple robes, with the marks of having been flogged. And Pilate declared, "Behold the man." And the chief priests and the crowd yelled out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate told them, "You take him and you crucify him yourselves, for I find no guilt in him." This is when the chief priests slipped up. That's when they said that Jesus deserved to die in their estimation of things because he claimed to be the Son of God. And Pilate, upon hearing this, grew afraid. And he took Jesus back inside the praetorium and he asked Jesus a question of identity. "Where are you from?" But Jesus remained silent. Pilate reminded Jesus that he had the authority to let him live or to let him die. And Jesus told Pilate that the only reason he had any authority to do this was because Jesus, his own Father in heaven, had given it to Pilate. Pilate made every effort to release Jesus. But the Jewish leaders reminded Pilate more than once that if he were to release Jesus, he was no friend of his own king. He was no friend to Caesar. For everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. It's interesting that even though he didn't quite have it right, Pilate actually understood Jesus' identity better than those Jewish leaders did. There are a lot of people today who would agree with Pilate. They don't think that Jesus was anything more than a man either. And they recognize that what happened to Jesus was unjust. And if it had been there, they would have tried to help Pilate find a way to release Jesus, because they are people who are willing to stand up against any sort of injustice in any form that it raises up. They want to fight against injustice. But they would have failed too, because Jesus' unjust suffering for sin really was God's plan. John notes that it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was the day when the lambs would be killed and their blood would be smeared on the doorposts of each home. They would be remembering that day when their ancestors had done the very same thing, and how the death angel passed over their homes as a result of it. They did not deserve to be spared, but they were covered by the innocent blood of the lambs. The death angel would enter into those homes that were not covered by that innocent blood. And it would take the life of the firstborn son, a tragedy which would compel Pharaoh to set Israel free. One son would be too many. But the death angel is going to come to every son. It'll come to all of those who are unprepared. But instead of taking them, it is God's one and only Son who dies in their place. And it is his blood that is put on the post to cover the sins of every son and every daughter. For we are all under the penalty of sin. We are all worthy of death. We have broken the law. But Jesus takes our place. It is his blood that is shed. The death angel passes over and we go free. He is the Lamb of God who came to take away the sins of the world, as Nathanael declared. But not just ours, the sin of the whole world. When Pilate then presented Jesus back to the crowd as the King of the Jews, they said, looking at Jesus, "We have no king but Caesar." What about you? Who's your king? Who really is your king? Who is it that you order your life after? And who do you follow? And who do you let make rules for you? Have you chosen Jesus, the Lamb of God, who can help the death angel pass over? Or something else really the master of your life? You know, Jesus said you can't have two masters. You'll love one. You'll hate the other. Jesus was crucified. He died on the cross as a sacrifice for sin. And 3 days later, just as he proclaimed in advance, according to God's great plan, Jesus rose from the dead, and he was the first to rise, but he won't be the last. All who hear his voice, who recognize the truth of the voice that's calling them to follow, who recognize that Jesus is the Son of God come to save, will end up following him into eternity. That's why we celebrate Jesus' resurrection every year. It gives us hope. It allows us to face the uncertainty, the losses, the sorrows, the diseases, the injustices, even when those things lead to death. Because we understand by what Jesus has done that that's only temporary. For one day we will follow him into that place where there's no more sorrows and no more tears, because the penalty of sin has been paid and there is no place for sin, where Jesus has prepared for us to live with him forever. I have no other Lord, no other Master, no other King, but Jesus, the Son of God. And I long for that day when I will follow him into that place that he has prepared for those that make him the Lord of their lives. We've come to celebrate. He is risen. That was so weak. He is risen. And one day, so will we. We have a hymn of invitation that we're going to be using to celebrate that one day we will rise with him